All right, everybody, welcome back to our second episode from our hiatus. Great to be back with Liam. You can check us out on multiple streaming services: Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and a couple of others. Liam, what are the other two? I'll let you. I
Oh,
always forget the other two.
Podbean, Amazon, Apple, Spotify, something else. iHeartRadio, I think.
iHeartRadio. That's right.
Yeah, and then of course
iHeartRadio.
there's the video is on YouTube.
You got it. So welcome back. So we're trying something new, and Liam and I are going to talk about Gaza today. I'll talk about the human aspect of what's been going on, share with you a story about a book I read, some personal testimonials from the writer, and then Liam will talk about the ideology a little bit, and then we'll see where the conversation takes us. I think it's important to address what's been happening over 20 months, almost 2 years now, right? In October, it'll be 2 years,
Yeah.
and how people still are defending this genocide. Um, um, but I think to a certain extent, Liam, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm starting to see, although, some of the rhetoric is empty, some of the mainstream media is starting to turn, right? I mean, we see Piers Morgan starting to flip a switch
Yeah. And
to,
when
to a
somebody
certain
as
extent.
right wing as Piers Morgan is suddenly on getting it.
Yeah. And I think Dave Smith, the comedian, does a really nice job of combating the silly arguments that Israeli spokespeople have, especially Natasha, who was on Piers, and then David Menzer, who was on a couple of newscasts the other day. He was just totally destroyed. I find it interesting, just like from you have to be, you as an Israeli spokesperson, you have to be really, really gullible to think that people are going to believe your empty rhetoric, your nonsense nowadays. I mean, how blind do you think people are when the genocide's happening in 4K?
Yeah, it's not really the point. And this, I don't know, it touches on something we've talked a little bit about before about the way political language is used.
Mm,
Oftentimes, if you take seriously what they're saying and then spend the time fact checking or talking about them, it's kind of missing the point because they're aiming at people who will already believe this or who are in on it in the sense that they know it's not honest.
right.
It's like any kind of political spokesperson. Look at the people who stand up and speak for the president at press conferences all the time in this country. They are lying their asses off a lot
Yeah.
of the time. And that's sort of expected. And what it's supposed to be is the media's job to take in what they're saying and then provide context and say, the administration said this is what's actually happening. And we've lost a bit of that sense in the media that it's responsibility as the fourth estate. It's fallen a bit. And a lot of our media today is very explicitly partisan. So they will there are news outlets that will take in what a Democratic administration says and state it as if it's perfectly, face value, this is true. And then there are
Right.
outlets that take anything a Republican administration says, face value, this is true. And then when the other side screams because each one are partisan, people can ignore it.
Yeah. And I think a good example, but I won't say perfect because he still denies it's the genocide, is Matt Miller in his interview on the podcast where he came out and said, I know Israel's committing war crimes. And so the question posed to him was, well, why didn't you say, well, because I can't express my personal opinion. I can only express the opinion of the administration.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, that's what we're seeing,
Yeah.
a constant perspective of the administration, not personal opinion,
Right.
right?
And we see way too much reporting that just takes what the Israelis say at face value and way too many media sources that don't call out the nonsense of, okay, something bad happens, and then other countries will say, naughty, naughty, and Israel will say, we will investigate ourselves and tell you what
Yeah,
happened. And the media is just like, okay, Israel's going to investigate and they will tell us what happened. And that's not how this is supposed to work.
right, right. No, I agree. And I think Piers has started, like the interview with Natasha, one of the attorneys that says she's not defending Israel, but it's part of a coalition. that stands up for Israel. He was calling out, was calling straight out bullshit.
Mhm.
Like the family that died, the family that had 10 kids and 9 of them died, the physicians. She said there were conflicting accounts of the report. So you don't believe that 9 kids died? Well, there's conflicting accounts, Pierce. He goes, that's despicable, basically.
Mhm.
Now I'm calling out your bullshit,
Yeah.
right? And so blatant disregard for any human life. And when you're a puppet to this government, then you're going to defend them till your last breath. And for you to deny that 9 out of 10 children, and the parents came out and said they've died, colleagues have said this has happened, you're still denying it. What conflicting accounts are you talking about?
This is one of the good things about independent media, and honestly, it's one of the interesting things seeing people like um, Piers Morgan, or I don't know, scumbags like Tucker Carlson pissing off their employers and then going and doing their own thing, which,
Right.
you know, as long as they can make money off of it and do it, it's not somebody else's line that they have to toe, right? They can say what they want to a greater degree. Um, but the people who end up getting shows like that that take off on the internet are people who already had an audience somewhere else, which means there was something already known and problematic about. I mean, Tucker Carlson's a straight up white supremacist. Please, I'm not, but
You're not advocating for him. You're just
things
kind
like
of
but it's interesting the kind of things that he'll say now that he wouldn't have said at Fox, like calling out other Republicans for beating the drum for war with Iran. When
right.
if the administration is hostile toward Iran, Fox News would have always towed that line and focused only on Iran bad, Iran bad, Iran bad, and not, hey, you're talking about a whole bunch of Americans dying for what? What's the point here? Um, so it gives you a little bit more freedom, and that's good or bad. It means that people like Tucker can also show their fascist roots more clearly, but um, there's a place I think for different forms of independent media, and it's one thing that I'm hoping we're helping with.
Yeah. And I think the part of it is also understanding, and I think you and I, before we signed on, we talked about kind of sharing, not kind of, but sharing the personal stories of the individuals on the ground, right? We see, I find it interesting that no matter how many doctors come out of Gaza, how many personal testimonials, there's such a big denial, and we know that whether it's Kufi, APAC that funds these various lawmakers, denial is going to be at the top of their list. But I read a book recently by a gentleman who lives in Gaza and continues to live in Gaza. The book is called A Journey from Misery to Hell. And he was a pharmacist that lives in Gaza and continues to live in Gaza. And very well written. I'm a big fan of books that are less complex, less dense to read. And this book is well written from a simplicity perspective because it pulls on people's heartstrings. He captivates you by using a certain phrase. My friend, at the beginning of the book, he talks about you can either choose to read this book, my friend, or you can go on about your day. But if you want to understand what's happening, I encourage you to engage in this book. And the way he's written the book, he talks about from day one to even May of this year, his experiences with displacement, destruction of his pharmacy, friends that he's lost, the love of his life and how she's kept him going, family has kept him going, and his passion about giving back to people. Um, and if you haven't gotten this book, and I'm going to plug it now, it's you go to lulu.com, and the book is by Muhammad Sardah. It's called A Journey from Misery to Hell. And one of the things I appreciate about his writing is that the stories he tells of different folks. And there's one story that stood out to me when I read it, and it was in the last few pages of the book about this young man named Akram. And I had met Akram on one of the lives on TikTok. He's a singer, and he was on one of the content creators' lives, singing, entertaining people, keeping his spirits, and his family spirits upbeat. Now his wife was pregnant, and he had already had a baby. And so that night, I invited my daughter to sing, who sings worship music, and she was, she's very conservative with her singing, but she felt like she had a need to sing, so she sang on the live a couple songs, I think it was, and a couple weeks later, he's on his way to water dispensing area because he was working with a friend of his to provide services for an orphanage. And unfortunately, as he was restocking the water to take back, he was bombed and he was killed. And this story, as I'm reading it in the last few pages, I'm like, I know this young man. I met him personally. I talked to him, and I share that because the testimonials that are coming from the ground are not anything but heartfelt. They draw on your heartstrings. They're true testimonials. Yet their resilience to be steadfast, their willingness to move forward. Because if you were to talk to Sardah as he came up on any live, you wouldn't tell that he was experiencing what he was experiencing, the loss of family, not being able to see his family, not being able to eat, um, moments of defeat, moments of triumph, especially when there was the initial ceasefire called. And so he asks me, I said, he goes like, what should the second part be about? I said, that's a tough question, but I think here's what I would say if I were writing a second version of this book. I think people in general need to know how you got through all the adversity. Because although your adversity may not be comparable to the next person, it's still adversity. And how do they overcome it like you've done? That's the testimonial I think people would want to hear. Like, how did I overcome all this tragedy, all these challenges, starvation, displacement, loss of life? And then when you share that testimonial with others, like, man, if this guy goes through, and I recognize everybody goes through different challenges in life, but your story is going to help the next person that experiences something similar or less similar, right? But experiences headwinds or challenges in life. So great book to check out. And I think those are the testimonials I hear every day, whether it's the journalist, the family, the mom, the dad. And then when I hear these journalists and when I hear these lawmakers who are morally vacant and spew empty rhetoric, whether it's the German chancellor, the French president, the UK PMs, all right, now what? What are you going to do?
Right.
Being neutral during a time of genocide will paint you in history as just as complicit as those dropping the bombs.
Right. The God, the leaders now, it's largely because more and more the public are seeing what this is, that they feel they have to speak out. But are they missing that we have 600 days worth of their actions already? There were attempts to sanction Israel in the UK, and we found out that they actually gave them more money during that period. And right now they're talking about blocking, arms sales and whatnot in places like France or whatever here. But Israeli weapon sales are going up. They're like buying as much as they can now, which means they're still contributing. And
Mm-hmm.
they may be like, well, we just need this, that, or the other thing for our own military or something. But you're choosing consciously to support a genocidal regime. There are, there are like at least 3 different angles that come up for me in what you were talking about before. So I don't know where we want to hit different things there, but the one of them that first stands out to me, and I want to come back to like a personal side of this and talk about other places where those testimonials are really, really powerful and effective in our history. But the reasons for denial I want to get at, because it's difficult oftentimes for people to wrap their head around that. Like, here you are, it's live streamed in high definition. You can see it. You can tune in every day. You can see rockets used against individuals.
Right.
Some dude's just walking out there, getting water, boom, it hits it,
Yep.
And they have high definition recordings on all sides of this. The Israelis know a person is there. They're intentionally targeting them. We understand the operational directives. There's been enough exposure about this. There's people inside saying, hey, we are intentionally targeting schools full of refugees. We are intentionally targeting hospitals. But the official government line will always be denial. And that's what's believed by people who want to support it. So I
Right.
want to make a parallel,
Sure.
right? Um, so take okay, what's a really well-known historical event, just in general? You know, a real well-known, like, I don't know, war, major event, last a few years.
World War II. Let's just take World War II.
Okay, so just World War II, like as a whole, right?
Right.
All the military stuff around there, right? Now
Hmm.
we have tons of documents, tons of video footage and photographs taken, tons of testimonials of people all talking about this happening, right?
Right.
But for the Shoah, for the Holocaust, there's a whole industry around denial of it, right?
Right.
And the amount of material that survives that explicitly documents Nazi atrocities and all of their collaborators across Europe, east to west, documents in stunning detail what they're doing. Of the Nazi material alone, 6,000 tons of paperwork survived.
Hmm.
Purchase orders for the stuff that went into building gas chambers, like the receipts, literal receipts,
Right.
tons of material. Plus, there's tons of material in all these other countries, from tons of other places, from partisans, from people who are recording stuff, from media, and yet there's a major industry denying it, right?
Sure.
It is easier to deny. I don't know. Let's go a little further back, right? Go back before you have tons of movie cameras. Look at like the U.S. Civil War, right?
Hmm.
4 years of grinding hell. 600,000 plus Americans dead. Who's going to deny that the Civil War happened? It's historically easier to do than to deny
Right.
the Holocaust because there's less documentation.
Sure.
Simple fact. There's less material proving
Right.
the Civil War happened than there is the Holocaust. So why do people deny it? Because we are going to encounter people denying Israel's genocide of Palestinians for the next century.
Yeah.
In the same way that
Absolutely.
we have it for Nazi atrocities. They do it for ideological reasons. And that's the part that
Tell me more.
um, let's just think about anyone's political beliefs, anyone's personal beliefs, right? You
Hmm.
want to think, I don't know, that they're justifiable, that you're the good guy. You don't want to, no one wants to go around thinking, hi, I support like really horrifying shit in the world, right? People can have today in this country beliefs that are fundamentally identical to the tenets of Nazism and will explicitly deny that they have anything to do with that and that they're good guys and they just want to protect their country. And it's those they're somebody else. They're the other side. The other side is more like them than me. People don't pay attention to it. No one wants to know that their positions are problematic, right?
Hmm.
Or any kind of racist or fascist ideology to spread, for genocidal ideals to spread, for nationalism to spread, you have to downplay the consequences of nationalism.
Mm.
The way that nationalism inherently others people, it dehumanizes them. It says that they're different from us, like they're inferior to us, right?
Right.
They don't fit our definition of suitable citizens or subjects. There's you have to somehow, if there are demonstrable atrocities, you have to somehow downplay them. You see this in tons of areas. You can see it in Holocaust denial. You can see it in denial of the Israeli genocide, of course, right? But in tons of other areas as well. Look at, for example, the very dishonest rhetoric you see when people contrast socialist and capitalist ideals, right?
Hmm.
Because there's a twist in what they're doing. Now, if you're going to talk about the crimes of, say, the Chinese state politically, right?
Right.
Then talk about that. That's because that's the subject there. But what people do is they'll say socialism is both the economic system and the political system, but capitalism is only the economic system. Therefore,
Mm.
capitalism is not responsible for imperialism. But it literally
Uh,
is. It's responsible
right.
for slave
They
trade,
don't want
for
they
Europe.
don't want to conflate the two.
I mean, there are hundreds of millions dead directly attributable to this. I mean, the population fall off in South Asia alone is reckoned to be somewhere around 200 million people over the century and a half of over a century and a half of British rule. Like huge consequences for people. Why was Britain there? for profit. But we don't make that connection. We separate it. We say, oh, that's the British government. Capitalism is this different thing. But then we push them together. People do that because they have a reason to defend something. They need to separate the crime from the thing that they like.
So I have a question in terms of that. So I recognize that it's easy for people to deny the atrocities and that they prefer to align themselves with their response, which is, no, that's not happening. Isn't that a question of morality, though? Someone's moral conscience to say, look, no matter what's easy for me, my morals tell me that what I'm seeing in real life in today's environment, right? Because we know World War II or even events that happened in the 90s and early 2000s are not showcased as much as this genocide is.
Right.
How do you morally not recognize what's happening if your morals have been bought already?
Well, the one thing that I notice a lot with people discussing this, and this is a common problem that I see among both self-identified liberals and leftists, is that question of morality and not recognizing that the other side is also advancing what they view to be a moral argument. Remember, the Nazis thought that what they were doing was moral. They had reasons to believe that, but the system is different, right? It's we would consider it to be somehow morally bankrupt. So a lot of the apologists for Israel's crimes, they what they are doing in their own mind is advancing a moral argument that for them includes 2,000 years of atrocities against Jews and the desire to have a place that's exclusively Jewish where they don't have to worry about that. And to them, that justifies atrocities. That penchant for justification depends upon the framework you have, what you're viewing. I'll give you a fun, completely irrelevant example here, right? So I'm sure anybody watching this is going to know who Karl Marx is, right? It just at least as a person, Hungry Santa, right? So Karl Marx had an idea in his head about phases of history that you had to go through, stages along the way, something he borrows out of like Hegelian thought, that you're moving through these stages. And one of those stages, in order to get to socialism and communism for him, would be bourgeois capitalism. So you had to go through that. So for him, the dude literally supported British imperialism in South Asia because he looked at Indian society as feudalistic, which is a misapplication. It wasn't, right? But given the sources he was looking at, he had an interpretation of the Indian economy, said that they are backward, that they need to be forcibly industrialized and create a bourgeoisie and a proletariat, a working class and middle class out of that. And out of that, the historical conditions for socialism could develop, which means he's willing to accept significant atrocities to get to the goal, right? Because he thinks it's inevitable. It's the framework, right? So what you have in the moral argument around people here talking about this stuff, right? They're talking about it in a way that says it's honestly okay. Like it's honestly okay that people are driven out of their homes, that people are killed, because that land needs to belong to Jewish people so they have a place where they're safe from 2,000 years of murderous Christians and Muslims and everybody else and blah, 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 all this stuff that they talk about. It is a moral argument.
They use as justification.
Right. But it's a moral argument that has it has a different subject, right? For them, protecting Jewish lives is moral regardless of the cost to other people. For others, that's not the same kind of calculation you can make. It's one of the reasons that the slogan that comes out of early discussion of the Holocaust, the "Never Again," is still really contested, because for a lot of people, "never again" means no genocides, no ethno-nationalist violence.
Yeah,
right? Nothing
correct.
like this regime should ever exist again. Radical nationalism is a bad idea. For others, it means never again to me.
Right. They personalize it.
Right, which is why you have groups, and it's not just Jewish people in Israel or the diaspora that take on views like this. I've seen like tons of neo-Nazi movements in places like Armenia or Ukraine amongst people who were literally massacred by other nationalist regimes. Like seeing Armenians embrace radical ethno-nationalism when it was Turkish ethno-nationalism that killed a million of them. It's it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But
I, you know,
but it's that never again only to us.
I've never seen a government like Mostrich who touts starving a population,
Oh gods, yeah.
touts ethnically cleansing them. Even Mike Huckabee recently interviewed was interviewed, and you talked about how the French want to recognize a Palestinian state. And I find this very laughable. Well, if the French want to recognize a Palestinian state, so why don't they carve up a part of their country and give them their state? No country has any right to determine what a sovereign country can do. Wait a minute. They're occupying the territory, dude. They've ethnically cleansed Palestinians and displaced them since the early 1900s.
Right.
What on God's green earth are you talking about? And so I find this very different than what I've ever experienced, and I would imagine people experience in other atrocities where government officials like this. And look, we can talk about Nazis and their blatant rhetoric, but I feel like these government officials are I don't feel I know they're mirroring exactly the same rhetoric that Nazis did, like Smotrich, like Ben Gvir. You know, when you place a blockade for 90 days as a government to cause mass starvation and try to justify it because you say Hamas is taking the aid and stockpiling it, then the argument is if that's the case, if they're stockpiling it, they're holding on to it, then who are you starving then other than the population?
Yeah.
It's very blatant. And it's because they act with impunity. And a perfect example is that the ceasefire that was called just recently, U.S. vetoed it because they didn't see what was supposed to be in the resolution.
Right. People should just die while we argue over wording. This is such a long story too. One of the things that bugs me about this, on the one hand, but also I'm cheered that more people are paying attention to what people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are saying, because those kind of statements in the Zionist far right have been there for a century. It's not the rhetoric is not new. Arguments for total ethnic cleansing are not new. In fact, they were extremely common before the creation of the state of Israel. Even people on the labor left, the Zionist movement, were calling for the conquest of 90 to 100% of the land and the expulsion of the entire population. This was not a question. And they were using language like colonialism. They called what they were doing a colonial enterprise. And today they lie about it and say, well, no. The creation of Israel is an example of decolonization because they just went back. And like, that's not how it works. It's just not. There's so many places where this kind of thing could be misused. I don't know. Does Italy have a right to conquer Britain because it used to control England in the Roman days? I mean, what are you talking about? It's nonsensical.
It's very nonsensical. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
But yeah, I'm glad that more people at least are seeing some of that rhetoric. They're seeing the eliminationist arguments, because one thing that's absolutely fundamental to the entire process, and something that liberal Zionists have long been guilty of papering over or ignoring, is that the entire concept of Zionism as an ethno-national movement is genocidal. It's why we had UN resolutions going back many decades calling it a racist ideology. It's founded on the notion of an ethnocracy. Now, there were more leftist strains of Zionism that said, hey, we're going to integrate with Palestinians. We're going to create like a single worker base. We're going to create a socialist economy that unites everybody, that didn't want to expel everybody. They were a minority. They did
Yeah.
exist, but they were a minority that was sidelined by the time you get to the 1940s and went into steep decline thereafter. Because the form of Zionism that took over and dominated the major political parties in the pre-state period and in the creation of the state always aimed at ethnocratic control of the land.
Yeah.
They wanted democratic institutions, but a Jewish character of the state. This requires the minimization or elimination of Palestinians. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
you can't have a democracy.
You're right, and I think part of that also, along those lines, when David Ben Gurion, I think even in his memoirs, talks about, and even in Elon's book, he talks about this as well, is that when these various Palestinian villages were attacked or communities, if there wasn't a response, that aggravated the Zionist party because then they can justify their response back. There, and so when you had Palestinians respond, they were looking for that, and then the communication be to the external world, the global communities. There's an existential threat,
right?
But when they didn't respond, the Palestinians to that aggravated the Zionists even more. And as Elon Pape talks about this, and so they needed a response from the Palestinians to justify their actions of ethnic cleansing, of displacement. And so I think you bring up some good points, and I don't think anyone that I don't debate. I try not to debate. I don't debate. I don't get on these lives as much as I used to because I'm just tired of dealing with people denying a genocide.
Yeah.
I truly believe none of these folks. Look, TikTok is a whole different animal. You have some Zionists that come up that probably haven't picked up a book in days, and they're collecting coins and whatever the case may be. But I find it interesting that none of these folks, that historically it's revisionist. It's a revisionist history.
Yeah.
And no matter what they see with their eyes, and I was talking about this earlier, no matter what they see, what they witness, they don't believe it.
Yeah.
And it's willful ignorance, right? And
right.
So,
and it's been there all along. If you want to selectively choose material, just for anybody who, if I'm trying to figure out how the captions will work with Zoom. So if these captions actually stay, I noticed it took Elon's name and made it Elon, like Elon Musk.
Oh,
Elon Pape and Elon Musk are
two different people.
Yeah.
Actually, well, Pape, if y'all listening, is Pappe.
Yeah.
The name is spelled correctly. The first name is spelled when he says Elon Pape. So
and Elon is like it's an I. So it's But yeah, it's just in case we get miss
like, what? Not Elon Musk.
We're not talking
who just dropped the bomb today, talking about how DJT is in the Epstein file. Come on, Elon.
Their little spat because now he's saying, hey, why don't we just cancel all the contracts that are going to this guy, making him billions? Like, hey, that may be the first thing I agree with Trump on. So cool.
Yeah, no, I do want to get to that a little bit later because he dropped a couple of bombs. But go ahead.
But yeah, the denial part, it's how you selectively use material and how you can intentionally stoke emotions, draw things out. This is something that, and for people who are like, why are you always picking on Israel? Like, well, I don't know, maybe because it's one of my areas of expertise, and people talk about all kinds of things, and no government should be doing this kind of crap. But the to think about how this is done, how you intentionally create that sympathy, right? Go back. Oh man, just go back into the late 1920s with like the Western Wall riots. They went into the Mughrabi quarter that had been there since the time of Salah ad-Din, and they intentionally obstructed traffic. People had always been allowed to pray at the wall, but lots of people coming and praying at the wall. And then you put down chairs and lecterns and dividers, and you start like taking over what is a pedestrian walkway to get to work or home in an actual neighborhood. And they keep building that up until people get angry enough. And then you have a riot on your hands and you say, look, 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 they hate Jews. Like they just want to kill all the Jews. Like, no, they're responding to a very specific incident affecting their lives. What we tend to do always in
Right.
a lot of media reports and a lot of like, the revisionist type histories that show up in popular accounts, what a lot of these people are talking about is they leave out always the provocations. The people who want history to start on 7th October, they want to say Palestinians
Yeah.
hated Jews or something and ignore the fact that there were Palestinian Jews and there were people who worked with early waves of Zionists and were trying to build something that were in shared organizations. It wasn't some irrational cultural or religious hatred. It's a response to systematic dispossession, to ethnocratic apartheid, to the conditions of life. And we hold
Absolutely.
everywhere a right in international law for peoples to resist, oppression. There are still rules to that. There are still war crimes. Groups like Hamas have committed war crimes, but their right to resist the Israeli state is a
Right.
matter of international law. We don't apply it.
Yeah. I always say, no, no, say, finish. Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, we don't apply it in
We
this.
don't apply it.
We don't use it here. And this is largely a consequence of collective, like,
Right.
Euro-American, Western sort of guilt for anti-Semitism, but not actually solving the problem that created anti-Semitism. Instead, saying, hey, we support Israel. They can do whatever they want. See, we're not anti-Semites, which isn't how it works, but it gives them a free pass and brings out the worst impulses.
Absolutely. I always say you can when people ask, are they terrorist group or resistance groups? Like you can call them whatever they want, whatever you want. At the end of the day, they're resisting against an occupation, destruction of economy, the destruction of agriculture, the constant onslaughts. You can debate the tactics. I'm not going to, debate tactics. Okay, cool. They're resistance. Debate tactics. Don't debate with me whether they're a terrorist group or
That's
resistance
not,
group.
they have a right to resist. And that's the
Exactly.
And terror and resistance have always gone together. George Washington was a terrorist,
Meham Begin was, right?
I mean,
Nelson Mandela.
Exactly. Founders of countries tend to be terrorists. This is just a part of our history. And then in hindsight, you're like, they were fighting for freedom and boom, it succeeded. And then when they fail, you don't. Like groups like the IRA were terrorists and resistance.
Yeah.
They were legitimately resisting British occupation, which means that, legally speaking, they had some right to shoot at soldiers. But setting bombs in trash bins in London is a terrorist act calculated to create civilian deaths. So they did both. There are groups on that side that did both. But you can't debate that IRA was a legitimate resistance movement against 800 years of occupation.
Yeah.
That's just a fact. This is the same thing for Palestinians. And we don't do this. People who are like, well, there's never been a Palestine, there shouldn't be a Palestine, blah, blah, blah. Okay, cool. What about all these other countries? Where did Ireland come from? There were clearly Irish people before the creation of the Republic.
Yeah, Palestinians don't exist, Liam, although a ton of thousands of them have been killed over the last just 20 months alone.
Yeah.
So these people we don't exist, but
right.
And my grandfather and my uncle, I share this story because there was a documentary done on this, among other documentaries. My grandfather and my uncle, my whole father's family was pulled from church. Hoods were placed on their heads and they were executed by the Golani Brigade. So you're telling me that none of those atrocities happened when they happened firsthand. My father's property was taken by, at the time, the JNF and then eventually the ILA. And so that didn't happen. Well, no, it did, because my family is a testimonial of the fact that it happened.
Not even that. The records exist in Israel. This is the part that's infuriating to me, is that, and you mentioned before, like, people are noticing people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir's statements now. They've been saying this shit the whole time.
Yep.
It doesn't generally make it into translation or into our hands. Records of atrocities carried out by Zionist paramilitaries and by the state are collected. And Israel has a Freedom of Information Act. historians, scholars, sociologists
But do they?
can see it. They
But
read it, they use it. And then we just like, no, 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 that didn't happen, and just pretend.
yeah. Well, they have the Freedom of Information Act, but is it really freedom of information for the Israelis? And if they are, and if do they have the will to go and research, or they just take the information at face value that they're taught and say, you know what? No, they don't bother to go because look,
Right. That's
there's a ton of information about the Civil War that we can extract. There's a ton of information about World War, Vietnam, but how many of us actually go do the research to find out what happened outside of what our media tells us?
yeah, I get
Not
that.
many.
Yeah, people like will often take their early education, and honestly, the Israeli school system is calculated to radicalize people, to
Yeah.
turn to ethno nationalists, and feed that bunker mentality that they need. You get people coming out of the school system in places like Alabama or Louisiana in the US that honestly do not understand the US Civil War at all. And they're not going to spend the time reading the actual historians about it because their entire social environment has told them that it was a war of aggression by the North. The South didn't do nothing wrong, and it wasn't about slavery, and blah blah blah. That all this stuff, they're fine with that
Mm.
because it suits how they see themselves. It's very
Right.
difficult to look at it. It's how you can get to today. What polls of the Israeli Jewish population with 82% supporting the expulsion of the
Yeah.
population of Gaza.
Yeah.
It's nuts. But
That's a large number.
it is, but it's a consequence of decades of ethno-national education. And this
Yeah.
is how nationalist movements work. You indoctrinate people generationally into thinking a particular way. It's why the denial of late Ottoman atrocities is so common today in Turkey, because the entire Turkish education system is systematically denying that it happened and giving people alternative facts to explain it. So Turkish nationalists can feel, oh yeah, I can totally be a nationalist, and they can say we didn't do that, and at the same time, because they're still nationalists, but they deserved it. Like they don't
Yeah.
really get.
And, yeah. And I'm not surprised that people don't dive into whether it's the US history or other histories more, especially in the US. And I say that because people don't find financial literacy important. So why would they find history? Managing their finances is an extremely important part of life. Yet I'm not surprised that they're not going and digging deeper into history. Who for them it's like who cares,
we
right?
we have to just we have to stay on that treadmill. We have to keep going. Like everyone needs to work, to eat. Well, now who has time to think about the systems themselves? Who has
Yeah.
time to think about why are things like this? They know that they are a certain way, and they just have to do it. And you aren't given the time, the mental energy, the resources really to dig deeper, even if again the information is free.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the record of U.S. government lies from administration to administration to administration about what we're doing is astonishingly complex and real, and like it's there. It's humongous. It's like we have all the material. We have everything we need to say the government systematically lies to you every year about what it's doing, but most of us don't pay any attention to that. It doesn't get us to question legitimacy of the
Well,
institutions. We
the
don't
other part,
say, hey, look, if every president is lying about imperialist wars, maybe there's a problem with the presidency. Maybe there's a problem with what we're doing. It's always like, oh no, we'll just elect a better person next time.
well, I think the other part is you said it earlier. It's people ask the question, does this really impact me? And if it doesn't, it's kind of who cares? Let me just go about my day because I have other priorities. Um, but you need to stay well informed. You need to understand. And I think part of the problem also is this two party system.
Mhm.
I think that's a significant problem because electing the next person and assuming they're going to tell you the truth is a bunch of nonsense, right? I think that's a bigger issue that we've had
Yeah.
for decades. I don't recall I don't recall if there was a president that ever And has ever told the truth, and you correct me if I'm wrong on this. I mean, there's always something to be hidden. I mean, look at Kennedy and his involvement in the Vietnam War. Initially sending consultants, grew the consultant number. I think to a certain extent was deceived by what was happening, and launched the first offensive, causing what we know today is the Vietnam War. Right? I mean, and I wouldn't have known that had I not dug deeper into it, or watched a documentary about it. And people don't realize that when you ask them. And I think part of it is, like, again, we're running on this treadmill. It's like constant moving, moving.
Right.
I don't have time for this. It doesn't impact me. I'm not getting my big bang for my buck here. Let me move on.
And a lot of the problems, one of the difficulties, one of the challenges in bridging that gap and making it accessible to people at all, is that so many of our problems, they're systemic. They're not about individuals, but individuals are easier to wrap our heads around. So think about the way big business might work in the US. You might think, well, you just need like a more moral CEO and then the company will work right. I don't know, flashback to George W. Bush's administration, right? And
Hmm.
he received a massive open letter from a ton of executives in the energy sector and the fossil fuel sector, telling them we need regulation on emissions and drilling. We need limitations imposed by law, because otherwise we are going to keep doing this, and we know the consequences. We know this will destroy life on Earth. The problem is systemic, though, because a CEO cannot choose to stop doing the thing that makes profit for shareholders. That's their
Right.
job. That's the
Yep.
reason a corporation exists, is to make profit for shareholders. And if they don't do it, another company will. So if
Yep.
you elect a good CEO at Royal Dutch Shell or something that says, we're not going to do this anymore, well, cool. ExxonMobil is just going to do a whole lot more drilling instead. It still
Right.
can happen. The problem
Yeah.
is it's the
Yeah.
systems, the structures that are in place.
Hmm.
They are going to constrain actions. You can elect the most moral person ever. I mean, I don't know, arguably Jimmy Carter is a really nice guy, spent tons of his retirement building homes for poor people, a really strong Christian, like really seemed to care about a lot of issues. But when the Shah of Iran said, hey, we're going to lower the price of oil, he suddenly stopped talking about human rights abuses. It's the
It's
system.
it is cultural. It's cultural. Becomes cultural, I think.
It's cultural and systemic. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
even if you have some cultural elements in place, but the systems aren't, they work together. The
Yep.
system is going to constrain action. It's going to stop them from acting in particular ways. We have to understand that these systems are themselves a problem, but getting people who are busy, who have to work 40 plus hours a week, and they come home and they're stressed as hell, to think about the systems that affect their lives, because all of it does. It
Well, we all have stuff going on in our lives. I mean, there's no time to think about that. And I think you bring up a good example.
affects us.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the
Uh,
entire Israel-Palestine conflict directly affects us. It affects the way policing works in the U.S. It affects the military-industrial complex. It affects, our electoral system. There's tons of areas in which U.S. lobbying that is aimed at perpetuating the conflict indefinitely significantly affects a ton of Americans who might never have heard of the conflict at all, who know nothing at all about it, but their lives and their community are being affected by it.
Absolutely. And not to mention, I did some research the other day on this, that 17 cents per $100 paid into federal taxes just in California alone equals about $504 million that goes to Israeli aid. Just in California, ranked number one. This doesn't include the investments in bonds and other things that contribute to Israeli aid.
California does it directly. So not just
Yeah,
federal stuff, like the state of California invests in tons of Israeli companies and in direct aid to the state of Israel. And this, again, is created by what is honestly, in many respects, a well-meaning liberal Jewish population in the U.S. Because much of the Jewish population in the U.S. are not solid right-wingers. They're a fringe movement here, where there's a
mm,
lot more of them in Israel than there are here. But a lot of people here, the most liberal, nicest people, human rights for everybody, LGBT pride, all that stuff, they're like, yeah, no, totally ethnic cleansing is okay with us, because they have grown up with a particular understanding of crimes against Jews. So for them, it is a moral argument. And I don't think we win over the American Jewish population by just saying, hey, you're, by I don't know, attaching them directly to those crimes. You have to somehow disentangle them from the ideology, from
Mm.
the belief that Israel somehow makes Jews safer, because it
Right.
demonstrably makes the situation worse for Jews, both in Israel and in the diaspora. Huge numbers of Israelis want to leave the country because it is patently not safe and not stable. Its government is insane.
Absolutely.
It affects anti-Semitic attacks in the diaspora. So it's an absolute failure. The Zionist ideology was supposed to solve the Jewish problem by making Jews a people like anybody else who would be respected in the world and left alone, et cetera, et cetera. It's done nothing of the sort.
And what's interesting, even more recent, Ehud Olmert and another prime minister came out and said that Israel's committing war crimes. You had Amos Goldberg, who is a Israeli historian and Holocaust survivor, or family of a member of a Holocaust survivor, said that this is a genocide. What I also found out is right after October of 2023, 800 scholars and historians signed a petition saying this could potentially be a genocide. 800. And so to argue against that today is just baffling. I do want to come back to something you said earlier about it's systemic, it's cultural, and I want to bring it back to your CEOs because I think part of the systemic and cultural issue also is within the space of the presidency, right? Lawmakers and such. When you're making, let's just say take banks for example. And there was a debacle with a bank a few years back. I won't mention the name for various reasons in 2016. I always say this, right? And that CEO at the time, most CEOs in the banking industry, if you don't know, some of the top CEOs make $24 million a year. They make about 2 million in base salary plus their incentive, their their stocks, their grants, the whole nine yards. And so for a long period of time, this is cultural and systemic, this issue that happened in 2016, where the culture was you open all these widgets at an accelerated pace, you got rewarded for it, you got promotions for it. And this particular CEO was in front of the Senate hearing and had no clue as to what was happening. And the way I frame this is when you're the CEO of a large company like this and you're dealing with the next level down, which is the person that runs your retail banking, and you're sitting in a meeting and you're talking to Liam, for example, say, Liam, wow, what another great quarter in cross sell, revenues up in the retail bank. You're doing a really nice job. What is it that you're doing? Oh, here's what I'm doing. Liam gives me a response. I don't dig deep. I just take your word at face value because you are grassroots. You grew up with me in this culture and it's normal. And so, oh, great job, Liam. Thank you for sharing. I got to share the numbers on my, quarterly call with my CFO and tell people what we're doing around cross sell. Then what happens? Part of the culture is that people get tired. They get burned out of the constant pounding on their heads. You have to sell. You have to sell. And what do people do because of the pressure? They don't want to lose their job. They don't want to lose their benefits. They start opening bad accounts. And people don't realize that all that pressure from the top down and the lack of diving deep into understanding what's really happening causes a debacle with this institution. Right. Because it's systemic, it's cultural. But when when your goal as a CEO to generate profit for shareholders, and when you're making $24 million a year,
you have an incentive not to question the system.
You're not going to question the system.
There are two things that work there. One is the cultural that tells you, don't rock the boat. This is all working. We're making profits. Everything is good.
Right.
And the other part too, there are structural aspects. We use the term plausible deniability a lot in politics and less often in business, and it applies there equally because things are segmented for a reason. You don't necessarily tell the CEO, oh, by the way, we're going to dump toxic waste in the river. Someone below is making the decision and they are empowered to do that.
Right.
So that there's no actual consequences for the company as a whole or the people on top. We've always done this, and if you structure systems in a way that explicitly allows that. Think about the National Security Act. When we, we go back to like, what 47. We create things like the CIA and all this stuff. We create all these organizations. We give them autonomy. They're
Hmm.
autonomous parts of the executive branch, which means CIA's budget is a secret, its actions are a secret, and you don't directly report to the president. They have a lot of leeway to do stuff, and they've
Right.
used that in the past, and they've done things that are wildly illegal, and presidents can say, bro, I didn't know at the time. Like, but you're presiding over a system that gave them that freedom to do it in the first place.
Right.
So there's a lack of accountability because that lack of accountability is structurally built into the system deliberately.
Right.
Corporations work the same way.
Yeah, and so 216, this company pays billions of dollars in fines, right? Bring on a new CEO, retail bank is overhauled, new executives, you get rid of several lines, condense, compress. Then you go to a different business line and it's operating the same as post the debacle. So a plausible deniability, and okay, so they don't report to you. You have no systems in place to check the other lines of business. You have one line of business that's running in line now. You've got all the checks and balances, but you left this business alone for a long time. And here's why, because it's the mortgage business. And up until 2024, it was generating a ton of revenue for you, right? And then after 2024, you had rates go up and you compress from 11,000 loan consultants to maybe 1,000. And so that's no longer a viable business. You can care less how they're operating. You cared less before. You're still incentivized to increase shareholder value. You earn still 24 plus $1 million, but you still have a bunch of knuckleheads running this line of business similarly to the way the retail bank was running. And you think you're doing all the right things, but you miss this pocket of rotten apples that's going to someday be back at square one to where you were prior to the
Right.
debacle.
Yeah, people always act like, I mean, one of the terms we use here in politics about this is blowback. And
Yeah,
people always act like they're surprised. Oh my gosh, this bad thing blew up in our face when we were doing this awful shit beforehand. Like, I mean, no kidding. If you do a bunch of evil, fucked up shit, bad things are going to happen to people. I mean,
absolutely.
we supported for 25 years a violent authoritarian state in Iran. And then the Iranian Revolution happens, and we're like, "Oh my God, it's so bad! Oh my God, this new government is so bad!" Like, hello, who created a lot of the institutions? I mean, the current secret police used in Iran today were still they're the ones created by the CIA. So,
Well, who's the one? Yeah.
and it just took on the same responsibilities, kept doing exactly the same stuff. We created all of that.
Yep. Well, wasn't it Project X? I think was it called Project X at the time? I don't remember. 1953 when we
Oh,
overthrew the Democratic Party of Iran and put a Shah in place. Was it Project X?
not
I
um,
can't remember the exact name of it.
Ajax.
Project Ajax.
Ajax.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ajax was a CIA coup that toppled
Yeah.
the government. There was a Democratic government, and the Democratic government was trying to renegotiate a Qadr era deal that gave only 16% of the profit from all the oil to the monarchy, nothing to the country as a whole, nothing to the workers there, and a profit, not even gross. And they're like 16%. Are you kidding me? Like, we want to renegotiate this. Britain said, no, we want all the money. We're gonna keep going there. So they nationalized.
Yeah.
And that kind of stuff happens around the world when you deal with this. I mean, it's not uncommon to see attempts to push back against this.
Right.
Response was to topple the government in order to guarantee profits to those corporations. And this is where, again, there is a linkage between imperialism and capitalism.
Hmm.
We ignore in that context, but we connect in tons of other ones.
Yeah.
We don't separate the economy from the political in tons of other cases. There's a point I want to I don't know draw us back to that you kind of started us with.
Go for it.
You were talking about the human dimension of this,
Hmm.
right? And I ended up getting sucked into it as usual, like the ideological reasons people have for denying these atrocities. Because hey, if these atrocities are a consequence of this belief system that I share, oh my gosh, I might be responsible. No one wants to think that. So you have a firewall in your head that makes it very hard to deal with the direct evidence of your own eyes and ears.
Mm.
But these atrocities happen to real people, to ordinary people, and
Yeah.
they can write about it and they can tell us about it. It's the account you were talking about. It's a physician in Gaza who wrote the book, right?
A pharmacist. Yeah. He's a
Pharmacist.
pharmacist.
We had there's a great short book by a Hungarian physician. He was a star doctor. He ended up getting sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and he ended up being pressed into working on their medical experiments as a way to survive the war. And after the war, dude never practiced medicine again. He was mentally shattered by
Mm.
what he had to endure to survive, right? And
Sure.
the inhumane systems that were all around him. And yet people will look at that today and they'll say, nah, that didn't happen. It's just Jewish propaganda. They just made it up. But people experience these things and they tell us about it. And we have a responsibility to take that seriously, to hear their accounts and put them into context. So this is what scholars of the Holocaust do. They take these accounts and they connect them to all the context around it, all the documents, everything to show, okay, yes, this makes sense. This fits here. This is plausible. This happened.
Yeah.
We are going to do the same thing for Palestinians. We have so much material being generated by the NGOs, by the brave journalists on the ground, by all the physicians and all the ordinary survivors that are doing this. We will be writing about this for the next century, talking about all that's happening. But we still need to help people to understand and relate to it.
Yeah.
Because it's not just an academic exercise. This is happening to real people in real time, and we are responsible for it.
Absolutely. You know, I recall a conversation we were having. A young Palestinian comes up, content creator, and he was talking about an incident incidents that happened in the West Bank to his family.
Mm-hmm.
No reason why. I mean, you can watch The Settlers by Louis Theroux. You can watch the documentary. I've drawn blank on the name by the Palestinians and the Jewish documentarian. Anyways, he's taught to remind me the name.
What's the one you're thinking of?
The old something. My God, how could I forget the name of the one done by Bilal?
Yeah, I don't remember. There are so many good ones here, honestly, that take you right into these. If anyone wants to see, like,
it won the Oscar.
Getting older now, but look up "Avenge But One of My Two Eyes."
Oscar.
It weaves in 3 different sets of stories, and what it does is it actually helps to show you the radical nationalist ideology that you see in the Kach movement that is behind a lot of Israel's current atrocities. None of this should have been surprising. It's like people looking back later after World War II and saying, gosh, if only we'd known this Hitler guy was a bad dude. Like, hello, what about the book he wrote talking about what he believed?
Yeah. No Other Land was the name, by the way. No Other Land.
Oh, No Other Land. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. So many places where folks will tell you exactly who they are and what their beliefs are. And if you take seriously what those beliefs are, you can think about the consequences of them.
Yep.
If someone says, I am sanctifying this land and purifying it of Palestinians, what does that mean in practice? It means you're going to expel Palestinians and take them.
Absolutely. Well, the point I was making is this young Palestinian comes up, talks about what's been happening to his family in the West Bank, and the Zionist comes up.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe you. Her exact words. And I'm like, wait a minute. So why is there a conversation worth having for you if this guy is coming up and telling you what's happening to his family? Even when other Palestinians, me or others, are sharing their personal story, oh, I don't believe you.
Mm-hmm.
Why would I make that up?
Right.
What benefit am I gaining? Right? What benefit am I gaining about talking about people that have been killed in my family?
Right.
I'm not gaining any benefit.
Yeah.
My voice isn't the only voice that's allying folks with our cause. Right? There are millions of people that do that, and so I find it laughable and at the same time worth a ton lashing.
Yeah, and there's a sad irony in it too, because for how long were people perfectly content to deny atrocities against Jews around the world? To say that didn't happen? People are like reporting a pogrom where people poured into this shtetl in Poland and massacred a bunch of people and then left, and these like race riots that are happening, and then people are afterwards like, "Hi, this shit happened." No, no, good Christians wouldn't do that. Christians don't do that. That no, you must have done something to cause that. That's not real.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Forever.
I'm glad you brought up Christians because I'm I'm a Christian, right? Raised, born a Christian. People don't believe that I'm a Christian, but that's okay. I don't. It's you'd laugh at the comments. You're not a real Christian. If you're a real Christian, you wouldn't advocate for the Palestinians. Well, you understand I'm a Palestinian Christian, right? Because we don't exist. A funny story before I get to my point. So when we were going to this church some years back, and my wife did the recon, went to the church first, and met with the pastor. And my wife's Jordanian, by the way, and she's Christian as well. And she goes, "So when did you convert to Christianity?" This is a pastor. Like
2,000 years ago.
yeah, like how naive can you be? I posted something about the I posted something to the effect that talked about the pastors and the reverends and priests that have been quiet on this topic. And I thought it was kind of, I wanted it to be a scathing post about their complicity, about using their pulpit for anything else other than the defense. And I have a student that I teach privately, and we used to go to the same church, and he's the drummer. And I said, "Hey, can you tell me the last time the pastors talked about, or have any of the pastors talked about what's happening in Gaza?" And he goes, "Yeah, this, so and so did." I'm like, "Great, when?" "A year ago." And in what context? "Oh, just about activism." I didn't dive deeper. I left it because this was a private session about something else. I didn't want to digress. I'm appalled, and I understand the evangelical Christians that are Zionists and all that nonsense. I'm appalled as a Christian that not many Christians have stepped up, have spoken up about this genocide.
Yeah.
You can't call yourself a true Christian if you feel that our God advocates for this.
Right.
What God are you following? When people come into my comments and say you're not a true Christian because, if you were, then you would not defend, you wouldn't say free Palestine and XYZ. I'm like, what? I don't know what God you're following, but my God says, don't starve people to death.
Right.
Don't commit a genocide. Don't destroy the educational system. Don't destroy the healthcare system. Don't destroy mosques and churches, because Christians do live in Gaza.
On children.
Yes. And so if you're listening to this and you're a Christian, you can be pissed at me all you want. I can care less. At this point, I am not worried about your judgment versus your silence and your complicity in this genocide. If you had any moral conscience, and if you're not morally vacant, you're a true Christian, you believe that God's people are all people, then you would be speaking up. You can criticize the government and still be a true Christian. You can criticize the atrocities that have been happening and still align yourself with the Jewish diaspora that opposes what's been happening. But if you're not, and you're still quiet, and only choose to voice your opinion when it suits you, then you're no fellow Christian of mine.
The tricks there with Christian identity, as with really any other, is that for most people, it's more social than anything else. It's cultural. You don't spend a lot of time studying the doctrines, really believing it. Most Christians really don't engage with the Gospels and see what kind of person is Jesus to see how they should act. They pick it up from their environment. They pick it up from their churches and their families. And it's more of a cultural identity. There's no way that you can read the Gospels and think this is a God who wants this stuff to happen. And God, the question to your wife there, Palestinians are the first Christians. The first Christians. People have always been Christian there. It's What are you?
What does that tell you though? What does that tell you about someone who is in that space as a leader, a pastor who preaches the gospel and asks that question? What does that tell you about that individual?
They don't know a damn bit of the history of the church, for crying out loud.
They don't.
I mean, there were
They
Syrian
just
popes. Like it's a thing. It's like the whole area was Christian.
no, they don't. And I yeah, and so my other story, and then we'll kind of so when this started happening close to 20 months, right after a few months later, and we started seeing the onslaught in Gaza. So I called this pastor up and I said, this is a very boisterous pastor, very he's got who speaks up about various things in the community that are detrimental and a pitfall to the community, and had done a trip to Nazareth and spent time with family. Well educated, at least from my perspective, has a PhD. So I called this pastor and I said, I'd love to hear your opinion about what's been happening because a lot of lives are being lost, etc. This has been destroyed. This has been destroyed. And I thought I would get because typically I'd go for him for advice and well-spoken, good advice. And the response was, I don't know too much about what's been happening, so it's hard for me to kind of give my perspective on it. Wait a minute, you've done a trip there, you spent time with Palestinian families, you are very boisterous when it comes to other issues in our community, and boisterous, not boisterous. And you've never shied away from giving your opinion on things. You do it humbly. I'm not saying you brag about it. You don't know anything about it. It's too complex. At the time I didn't realize what that meant to me. And then as time moved on, I realized that there's no advantage for him to speak up. He can care less because it's either he's cognitively dissonant from what's happening and doesn't want to ruffle any feathers. I don't know who his alliances are. And so I said, my job is to, as I continue to learn, I'm still learning, is to every opportunity I get to talk about what's been happening so people understand the full picture. But for pastors to do that to me, it's like, what a bad taste you put in my mouth and my disassociating with you. I'm disassociating myself from you.
Yeah, it's sad how long that's been a problem too, and it just gets to the way that power is structured, and there are institutional reasons for that ignorance. It's willful. They're choosing not to care about certain things or to overlook them.
Right.
Because to face it is too difficult. It challenges the basic power structures. There were a lot of priests and pastors in Italy and Germany that called out the atrocities of the fascist regimes. They are a small minority. The
Yeah.
institutional structures of the Christian church in both of those countries went along with the Holocaust. And this includes the largest Christian church, the Catholic Church. They kept silent about it. The information was out. There were partisans talking about it. There were newspaper accounts. There was a ton of material on this. Hell, the anti-Semitic laws were there in place a decade before, and they just didn't comment. Right? What's that? The old Martin Niemöller, the famous poem, like first they came for the socialists, and I wasn't a socialist, and they came for the trade unionists. I wasn't a trade unionist. So you stay silent. It's the church is part of that, and the church has suffered too, but they stayed silent because they didn't want to ruffle feathers. They didn't want to risk alienating people in their communities because
Yeah.
somehow they thought it was better to hold a church together, even if members of that church are directly complicit in
Yeah.
atrocities. It should be the responsibility of people in power in the Christian church, as in any other religious organization, to call out those members and to call
Absolutely.
out those ideas.
No, I think it's an important point. So it's historical. It takes courage to be able to speak out against the wrongs that we see, the atrocities, because people have sacrificed a lot, their careers, their jobs, students who have been tainted because they're speaking out. Um, Nowadays saying free Palestine, as BB says, it's as though it's saying Sieg Heil, which I find so stupid. What a ridiculous argument.
Yeah.
But people have sacrificed a lot, and God knows how much more they'll have to sacrifice to speak up against these atrocities. Even the folks on the Medellin flotilla right now are had drones hover above them, so people risk a lot to speaking up about what's happening, and those that don't are indicative of their complicit. It's complicit. I truly believe it's complicit. It's historical. I know it's happened in the past. And I truly believe they're morally vacant. And there's a benefit to it for them not to speak up.
And
Um,
it's a responsibility on our side to do that. I'll give you
yeah.
an example of that, right? Um, we had a lot of important statesmen before World War II that looked at the Italian and then the German regimes and said, okay, they're doing a good job. They're fine. We have no problem with them. And then the war comes, and then suddenly they can. I mean, look at Churchill and the way people remember him. He's a great lion for the fight against fascism, but still, he's responsible for millions of deaths in the colonies and spoke favorably of the fascist states before the war.
Mm.
It's only
Yeah.
it interfered with international issues, like where it interfered with like the nation state that they speak up. It's not like they were moral. We give them a free pass, though. We
Yeah.
allow institutions of power to structure the narrative in such a way that they become heroes. We do this in the US too. We often think about World War II as the good war because we had to defeat Nazism. And we just sweep under the rug just how many people in America were explicit fans of the Nazis until Germany declared war on us.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't a problem. Like, we had an opportunity to take in a bunch of Jewish refugees, and we said, nah, fuck them.
Well, not just us, the UK as well. Remember, I mean,
Everybody. There was
right?
a conference
Yeah.
about this, and people got
Yeah.
together. Hey, should we change our immigration quota? Should we take in refugees? Nah. And then people like turn around today that they're using that against the Palestinian issue. What we're forgetting there too is that those refugees that should have been coming over in Europe should have been allowed to go home once that problematic regime is dealt with. And this is true of Palestinians in general. Palestinians who are expelled or have
Mm.
fled over the last 76 years, they have a right to return home. And
Absolutely.
systematically denied to them
Yeah.
by us. We're complicit in that in the same way that the US is complicit in Nazi atrocities.
An argument from some years back today. I forget who. Mehdi was interviewing two people, Palestinian attorney and some other gentleman, and he was talking about the right of return as a euphemism, that it doesn't really mean that they get to return. They have no right to return. And the argument back is then when you argue the reestablishment of a Jewish state, they have no right to return.
Right.
So, I mean, all these arguments you're using can be used against you,
Mhm.
right?
Could be.
And so I don't, I think there's like 15 million Palestinians in the diaspora, roughly. I think that's the number. And so as you speak of right of return, I'm not going to go back and live there. I'm one of those, individuals who's got a family here, raised in America, more than half my life, three-quarters of my life, if not more. But we do want to be compensated for my dad's land.
Mhm.
My uncles were able to build, their children had property. And so where's my dad's property? And if 194 is approved and allowed, then compensate for those. And I don't think a lot of people would go back. I think some people would
Right.
go back to where they're from, and that's fine. But others would want to be compensated. I don't know that'll happen in my lifetime. I hope it happens in my children's lifetime. But that's one thing that none of these leaders has ever advocated for, whether it was Yasser Arafat, not even Mohammed Abbas with Ohud Omar. He was asking for 60,000 refugees to return, not even a drop in the ocean. I don't know if that'll ever happen under this regime, and I don't know if the dismantling of the apartheid will happen in my lifetime, but it has to happen at some point.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that it's inevitable. Yeah. The problem here is that you can sustain things like that for a long time, and you can continue to rewrite history. Look at the number of people today who still blindly talk about the United States or the United Kingdom and whatnot, and just whitewash the histories.
Yeah.
They ignore all the atrocities. If this goes on long enough, if the Israelis succeed in ethnically cleansing Palestinians, and enough time goes by, people will forget and they'll whitewash those atrocities, and will, in the same way that we do it for tons of the explicitly genocidal acts this government carried out. They'll just
Yeah.
become footnotes. There'll be something historians talk about. There'll be something you're supposed to hear in a class, but won't really stick with you because we don't really deal with it. That's
Right.
the thing that terrifies me about international support for Israel and
Mm.
for especially the Zionist hard right, is that it could work, but the number of Palestinians, number of people who keep this issue alive, they and we are what prevent it from happening.
Yeah.
We have a responsibility to keep that memory alive and to prevent this from happening. And there have been tons of things that people just thought were inevitable, that it would last forever, that have crumbled.
Yeah.
And the situation here can change. And ultimately, that means that, and this is a very difficult pill for a lot of American Jews to swallow, Israel as it exists has to be dismantled. It has to
Yeah.
change because its fundamental core is racist.
Yeah.
If that changes, that doesn't mean Jews are suddenly a threat or they get killed off or driven into exile or anything. It means they're Jews who live there, and you
You're
create
right.
some new shared reality that gives people rights. But that scares people, because what that'll mean is it'll be Jews living in a country with other Jews, which is what happened in Europe and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
They're bringing the wrong morality to the table, and they're forgetting that Palestinians are not responsible for the Shoah. They're not responsible for pogroms against Jews. This was not the norm.
Right.
Atrocities against Jews by Palestinians are almost unheard of. It's not a part of the history and the shared reality, and it doesn't have to stay that way. We can go back and find a shared future.
Absolutely.
That means that the ethnocratic state of Israel has to be dismantled, and that scares the bejesus out of people. And I want to just, it's a good thing to wrap back to the initial point. One of the earlier statements you made about morality. If
Mm.
we're going to have these conversations with people, we have to keep in mind that they are making moral arguments from their perspective. We have to understand what that perspective is, what is the fear, what is the emotion that they're connecting to, and then talk about that. But if
Right.
we just dismiss them as immoral, which is tempting. I mean, and it's very tempting to say, yeah, obviously somebody like Ben Gvir is an immoral piece of shit. And I will say that all the time, but he's
Right.
to my standards. He thinks that he's moral.
Yeah.
If we want to reach the people that are taken in by him, we have to find out how and why that is and defuse that argument for them.
I always find folks that are taken in by him are complete sociopaths. Maybe that's my perspective. Or by Smoke Church or by BB. But I do want to come back to something you said about inevitably things get dismantled. And I want to give some historical perspective to this. The colonizer has always thought they can stretch their arms across the globe until people resisted and fought back. Algeria, Vietnam, the Ireland, the Berlin Wall, South Africa are all examples of where governments thought they can have a stranglehold on the indigenous population until they resisted back and they were dismantled. And the global opinion about what Israel has done over the last 20 months, and I think even shifted more in the last 90 days since the blockade, is going to force the views of many to ultimately lead to the dismantling. The only blockade that the only person or people blocking this is the U.S. The U.S. and the U.K. are the two that I think can ultimately change the narrative through some sort of sanctions embargo, some sort of abstention from a vote or non-veto. Otherwise, they continue to act with impunity. Global opinion can change, and it continues to change. We can force the hands of our governments through through our voices, but ultimately these administrations and these governments have to say, okay, enough's enough.
That
Right?
responsibility falls to us.
Yeah.
And we have to stop listening to the, whoa, global opinion, all this kind of stuff. Well, honestly, most of the world understood Israel as a settler colonial regime from the start, and
Right.
but it wasn't the Western European capitals or the US. Go figure, they were also colonial regimes. They were also
Of
imperial.
course.
They had an interest not talking about this. We, as a settler colony ourselves, have difficulty criticizing other settler colonies. Go figure, because our entire culture is built on the backs of dispossession and genocide and racism. It's pretty deep in our cultural DNA, and it's going to take a lot of people just facing that. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean that we as people are somehow fundamentally genetically bad people. It
Right.
means that there's something about our social structure, our politics, our culture that is problematic and keeps us supporting atrocities around the world. It's not just the Israel situation. The US has been on the wrong side of a lot
Yeah.
of conflicts around the world, targeting people and supporting colonialism.
Yeah, and I would break it like so. If I were to look at the U.S. as a whole, and this is I would break it up into several sections, right? I would say the population at large, and large part of it is a lack of understanding, right? So those folks need to educate more, need to learn more. And I'm not saying this is everybody. Then you go to the lawmakers, right? It's not a lack of understanding, it's willful complicity because of the funding they get, right? The monetary return they get on it. And then you go to administrations, and that's a whole different conversation because not one administration has ever been in opposition of what Israel has done. And I think only recently, and Donald Trump to me is his actions in negotiating with the Houthis, the Saudis, with Hamas on his own is not indicative of his support of the Palestinians because he wouldn't have vetoed this last ceasefire.
And literally calls for the expulsion of 2.5 million people from their homes. I mean,
And the interesting thing about that is if you listen to media outlets within Israel, the media outlets now use his rhetoric to say, well, the Trump administration wants this, so we're just following that plan. He retracted that plan, and you're just using that as your narrative to to cause ethnic cleansing and a genocide. So please don't bullshit me. I can't stand when I hear that nonsense. Um, so
yeah, the
I think there's a lot to unpack with the U.S. and how they understand what's been happening.
oh gosh, honestly, that should be a whole discussion we could do one week here, because it is tempting oftentimes to put it entirely into financial terms.
Mm,
Um, and there is a lot to that because of how corrupt our politics are in general by lobbyist money, and how much the military industrial complex, American imperialism are all connected to these things. There's a lot of money to be made. And there's plenty of U.S. businesses that have substantial investments in Israel, and all of that affects what they want, and that means the representatives are going to listen to them. But
right.
it's also cultural, it's also social. There are tons of reasons why people will choose not to look at this. In many cases, there are people for whom it is directly willful. They have the evidence and they choose not to care because they have
Right.
incentive not to. And there are others who are very selective about what they'll take in because they have those ideological blinders that say anything that happens is still okay
Yeah.
cause, and then they have a moral argument, a theological argument, something that stops them from actually recognizing the humanity of Palestinians.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because for decades we've been dehumanized, right? We don't exist. We never had a culture. We're terrorists, right?
Oh God.
Uh,
Yeah, I often tell people that. Okay, so we're about the same age, right? And so
yeah.
growing up in the U.S., if you knew anybody who knew anything about Palestinians, if they'd ever heard the word when I was a kid, you look at, like, the 70s, early 80s, it was like balaklavas and Kalashnikovs and taking over airlines. Like it was.
That was the stigma,
That's all people knew about Palestinians. They were terrorists
right?
who hated Jews because we didn't talk about it.
Right.
Their identity was systematically suppressed in our media.
Mm. Well, and the other part is how we've been portrayed in various movies. Everyone that speaks Arabic or looks Arabic is a terrorist. No professionals, no doctors, no engineers. So So that's been the radicalization of the U.S. population. Like, oh, he's an Arab, he's a terrorist, right? He speaks Arabic, he's a terrorist. You know why? Because in the movie I saw him put a keffiyeh on and he's blowing up things. Um, Yet when I tell people, when people see my picture like on my profile, and like, aren't you white? I'm like, no, I'm not. But that's a great way to deny my culture and my identity. You've pigeonholed me into being white. No, I'm Palestinian. We don't all wear keffiyehs. We don't all look dark. We all have different complexities. We all speak Arabic, but it's different type of Arabic. Um, but that is part of the dehumanization of the Palestinians for decades. Like when I talk to cousins that still live in Israel proper, they won't dare say Palestinians. It's Israeli Arab because of the repercussions of using our identity. You know, I still have an uncle and aunt. They're still alive. My father, who was born in 23, is not the oldest. I had uncles that were born in the early 1900s, and and so, um, but they've become my relatives have become so accustomed to listening to Zionist propaganda. I remember speaking to a cousin of mine. I no longer talk about the topic with them, and it was like, oh my God, it's the talking points from Zionism. It was the World Dictionary, the Hasbro. And I'm talking to my cousin. And I'm like, wait a minute. I'm listening. He's talking about people being thrown off roofs. He's talking about children, this and that. And I'm like, bro, these are our people. What are you talking? I didn't say that. I'm just thinking to myself, never broach that conversation with him again. Because one of two things is happening. One, he's drinking the Kool-Aid. Number two, he's afraid of what to say over the phone because God knows who's listening. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to put him
Right.
in that predicament again. And although I had a cousin that really, he's written a couple of French books, passed away about a year ago, that did a trip with Palestinians and Jews to Auschwitz to bridge gaps. I had a cousin that was in Rashid Khalidi's book, who was in the peace talks. I don't mention their names simply because of the doxing issue. But I have family members engaged in this process for decades. My uncle was a political prisoner for singing about Watan, right? Um, and so I find it interesting that they've, like I said, drank the Kool-Aid, or they're concerned about the repercussions. And so my family's always been involved, and I see no reason not to be involved now. So anyhow, I know I kind of digress completely, but
Oh,
hopefully
oh,
it makes sense.
it's important, and you hit a really, I think, crucial point earlier that, again, if you want, we can always come back to on a day. So I think, for me, I can end on a historical point. It's something that I had to think a bit about. I wrote a paper a few years ago, um, connecting the '80s action movie Iron Eagle into
Oh
its
yeah, yeah.
cultural context here. There was a significant push that begins in the 1970s and accelerates across the 80s and 90s to create a new enemy to justify the fear in America and the
Hmm.
spending on defense, right? All our bases overseas and whatnot, and Muslims had to fill that role. So you start seeing significant demonization of this. For me, wants a fun little collection of this, or and likes like movie reviews. There's a cool book called Real Bad Arabs, but like real with two E's, like in movies, and
Hmm.
lays out movie after movie after movie that was specifically caricaturing, demonizing, Arabs. And it's a thick book too. Uh, we had to manufacture an enemy, and
Yeah.
honestly, the entire rhetoric about the war on terror, much of that is directly provoked. If we were not there occupying other people's territory and exploiting its resources and propping up terrible governments that people hate, that people would not hate Americans.
Yeah.
That is blowback from direct imperial policies that we do. And we support it, though, culturally by
Yeah.
creating these stereotypes, by creating cartoon villains. The villain in Iron Eagle, it's like he's the insane leader of a country called Bilia, which is a very thinly disguised Libya. Uh, and it's just meant to turn Arabs into just cardboard caricatures, like, just, classic villains that we can just despise, all Arabs bad. That has consequences. And decades later, people who grew up on that, who grew up watching that propaganda, they're the ones now writing the bills, pressing the buttons, sending the weapons, supporting
Yeah.
the genocide of Palestinians. It's not a coincidence. It's a consequence of deliberate policy here.
Yeah. No, I appreciate. Yeah, I think we need to dive a little deep, not on the financial aspect of it. Um, I did want to first thank you. What a great conversation. I like the free flow and just sometimes going in and talking about other aspects, whether it's obviously Palestine, Gaza, and the Palestinians, and then diving into some parallels. Um, so thank you, Liam, again, guys. You can check out our episode on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Podbean, and one other I can't think of.
Heart radio.
iHeartRadio, yes. So check it out. I'm going to post a couple of videos today or tomorrow of the we posted last week, so I'll pull it up and post some highlights of it. So thank you all. Liam, anything to close for? And I want to
That seems good. Yeah, I kind of like the free conversations. We can pick a general theme and talk about things and see where that goes. But yeah, and then if people want later, we can get back into some of the dives into things, like the specific topics. But
absolutely.
wherever it goes is more up to the audience. You let us know.
I'll host a live tonight and ask my audience.